In this video, I'm making a completely finished shirt with no exposed seams. With regard to canvas, I'll link the one I used in the description from the lining company. It's a good average thickness and a good weight, I think. Fabric-wise, I'm using a cotton from Dalston Mill. Like I think I say at the end of the video, I don't particularly recommend it, but it is a good, cheap cloth for making a shirt out of. That said, you could also easily make a sample shirt out of calico. This obviously isn't the shirt, but I lost the shirt and I ruined the intro the first time, so I need this to last a minute and 10 seconds. If you're new here, I suggest you start with the Start Here playlist in the description, and if you think it'd be useful to other people, like the video so that more aspiring tailors like us can find it. And that is almost a minute and 10 seconds. Enjoy. Grain-wise, it's super simple. The sleeve, back and front are all long side to the grain. Our back pattern should be put on the fold. Unlike every other piece of clothing I've made so far, I think that if we want to alter a shirt in a fitting, it needs inlay on both the front and back seams. Wherefore, and due to the method of construction, if you'd like to do a simple fitting, give the pattern 2 cm on the side seams of the back and the front patterns, and 2 cm along both the sleeve seams. Usually I'd put the front up top next to the back to give it inlay, but with my fabric restraints I'd had to snuggle the sleeve up next to the back. As always, measure the grain line relative to the grain drawn on the pattern. Except for the back pattern, that's excluded from the rule for the obvious reason. On the centre front, mark on the edge of our placket to mark stitch and add whatever you need for whatever placket you want. In my case, 6 cm for no placket. I only barely have enough fabric, so I had to forego any inlay, and I forgot the second pair of cuffs, so I had to cut the second one out off screen. And I'm stuck trying to make them with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. The yoke, collars and cuff should all be long side to the grain as well, perpendicular, not unlike how we do the waistband. Remembering that we need another top collar piece for the collarbone repository, and 2 pairs of cuffs. And then I'm sure there are some people commenting, "I told you so," and laughing at me because of what I said about labelling patterns. Be sure to mark the centre points, those will all be important. For the collarbone repository, collarbones come in an awful lot of shapes and sizes, so we'll just use 6.5 by 1 cm, and assume a normal pedestrian business collar. Copy the fall again. On this one, draw on the seam allowances, so the machine line, and line the intersection from the tip that splits the angle in half. Right? Measure the bone length plus a centimetre or 2, depending on how much you want it showing. In my case, 7.5 centimetres from the intersecting seam allowances. Draw an angled line intersecting that point, and the top and side of the collar. Give our new line 2 centimeters, which will only be folded back, and we won't do anything else to it. And we only need the one, so the other piece is a bit of scrap. We can draft the gauntlet pieces straight onto the fabric. It just depends on how wide and long we want it. With the marks we made in our sleeve, we can do a 16 centimeter one, including a 4 centimeter long pointy bit. We want a 4 by 12 centimeter under placket. Then, for a 2.5 centimeter wide gauntlet, start with 7 centimeters, which is 2.5 centimeters times 2 plus 2 centimeter seam allowance. So 7 centimeters wide, and make that into a 12 centimeter rectangle. Extend one side up another 3 centimeters, and make another rectangle going across 4.5 centimeters for a 2.5 centimeter gauntlet. Create a 2 centimeter high isosceles triangle on top of that, unless you want it straight or curved there or something. Just give it 2 centimeters. It's best at this point to iron these once we get them. With the 4 by 12 centimeter piece, we'll iron it in half, inside in, and then iron both seam allowances into the center. I didn't, but again, for the over gauntlet, right side down, iron either side in 1 centimeter at the same point. Press the 2 long edges together. Now don't lose them. I didn't, again, but for the over gauntlet, right side down, iron either side in 1 centimeter, then the same at the point. Then press the 2 long edges together. Now don't lose them. With inlay, we'd need to mark stitch the side seams, and regardless of that, the sleeve gauntlet line and the balance points. Just for clarity, I'll leave in cutting out all the pieces, although it's no more complicated than you'd expect, I think. Depending on the placket you want, you may want to change the exact canvas you cut. But in most cases, I'd say you want a piece as wide as your placket to go on the buttonhole side at least, on the straight grain and only as long as the shirt front. For the cuff, collar, and stand, for the cuff, collar stand and collar fall, we'll just cut pieces on the straight grain with a bit of excess that will cut away once we apply the canvas. To clarify, 2 total pieces for the cuff, 1 piece for the rise, and 1 piece for the fall of the collar. We want to cut a piece to go inside of the gauntlet. That only needs to be the size of the finished piece. So, if you've creased your top gauntlet and traced around it to cut the 2 pieces, we want to cut a piece to go inside the gauntlet that only needs to be the size of the finished piece. So if you crease your top gauntlet and trace around it to cut 2 pieces that'll fit inside, you're doing well. Mark stitch all the center points and or center lines. We need them to attach things to other things. Mark stitch the seam allowances if you gave the front and back seams. Mark stitch all the center points and or center lines. We're going to need those to attach things to other things. Mark stitch the seam allowances if you gave the front and back side seams and front and back sleeve any inlay. And mark the gauntlet line and the balance points at the elbow and the waist. And mark stitch the front edge, which isn't the center front. Firstly, split the mark stitches. For my center front magazine of buttons, I'm going to first iron over the edges of my plackets to the inside, and then iron the extra fabric into the fold, giving me a completely finished edge, trimming off a little of the raw edge if needs be. For the left side, which is going to feature the buttonholes, I'm giving only that side the canvas, so that it'll receive my buttonholes more securely. I'm going to baste this in place down the front edge to hold it there until I get the buttonholes done, which will hold it. I'm going to baste this in place down the edge to hold it there until I get the buttons and buttonholes done, which will hold it for me so that I don't have a stitch down my front. That's just personal preference though, for my choice of no placket. You could machine it down, having no need to keep the baste in, could even just iron the inlay down the other way for a placket. Saying split the mark stitches over and over is going to get annoying. Sandwich the back between the yokes, both right side to the back. Doesn't matter which is which unless you have a label on one of the yokes, which I'm of the opinion that quality and style should speak for itself, but that's neither here nor there. Lining up the center points first, baste or pin them together along the non-straight back, easing in the tiny amount of extra fabric. Machine along the seam with a centimeter seam allowance. Press the seam and press the outer yoke up. Top stitch the seam allowance to the outer yoke from the inside with a 1/2 centimetre seam allowance. I wouldn't expect that you'd need to baste that, but maybe pin it and keep the outer yoke out of the way. I want the stitch visible from the outside. Don't bother backtacking it at the start of finish, and you may like to cut the seam allowance down after that. Press the seam again and press the inside yoke upwards. Back with the collar depot, iron over the 2 centimeters we added. Mark on either side of the stiffener line with half the width of the collarbone, and mark that onto the right side so that we can sew along it. Should double check it with your desired stiffener, make sure that they're parallel. Place it right side up onto the right side of one of your top collars. We can baste it with a single baste on the inside of the chalk lines in the collar. Machine along the parts we folded down and off the first side of the collarbone. Then up the other side and off on the other folded side, doing the final edge the same way we did the first. Press the collar flat. Really, I think it could be quite neat to prick stitch and fell them together, just a thought. To canvas the collar, apply the top collar to the canvas. Ideally, basting from the middle, starting at the neck side, and do that towards either side, smoothing the collar over the canvas. Then basting the other edge, smoothing down from the first bastes. Trim away the excess canvas, crossing the border of the top collar. To be honest, I don't have such a hard-on for using canvas in shirts. I don't mind the use of fusible canvases in collars and cuffs. But I will reach through time and reality to interfere if I catch anybody deciding to use fusing as their jacket canvas. Line up the center points of each of the two pieces outside to outside and begin to baste them at the seam, basting towards the edge with the collar folded around your hand to build in ease as you go. Then the same to the other side. Do another baste along the lower edge, starting in the middle again, smoothing the fabric down from the first bastes, still building in the ease. Machine them along the seam allowance only on the 3 sides, no need along the side sitting inside of the stand. Remove the basting and cut down the seams to reduce their bulkiness to a little less than half a centimetre maybe. At the points, trim down the angles so that the seams won't interfere with each other when they're on the inside of the point. Though at this point don't cut too close or you'll have a hole and it'll fray very easily. Use an edge board and press the seams open all the way up to the points, which I didn't do. To fold out, put your thumb into the points, folding the seams over to the canvassed side, holding them there from the outside, and fold the other piece over it. That's, I think, the easiest way to do it. Pull on the threads with a needle if necessary. Check that the points look identical. Iron the collar seam and we should be able to pull the seam towards the undercollar to hide the seam a little. Machine another stitch, half a centimetre from the edge now. No backtacking again. To canvas the stand, put one piece onto the canvas, right side facing away from the canvas, and I might suggest starting from one side, basically using a big pad stitch in order to keep them secure. Still rolled over your hand with the fabric on top. With the outer stand, i.e. the one with the canvas side down, center the collar, canvas side up, onto it. At this point, I'm going to baste these together from the center. So essentially how you want them to sit when they're done. On the inside piece of the collar stand, iron up a centimeter towards the inside. Then lay it right side down onto it and baste it from the center as well, with the piece we're basting underneath with the collar folded over our hand. This time also basting the curved corners of the stand together. There'll be some excess, or should be, that we can cut away, and you may like to chalk on the seam allowance here to follow. Start machining at the folded up seam to the other folded up seam on the inside collar stand. Again, hold them together to check that they're identical or at least very close. Cut down the seam allowances around the stitch, and you may want to layer them, but it's not totally necessary. Then, of course, around the curves, cut out triangles in the seam, making sure that you don't cut too close to the stitching or you'll get a hole. To fold it out, start with ironing the inner stand away from the collar, then folding out the rest of the stand, ironing that too. Iron the stand flat, or pull the seams slightly inwards, either way with the stitching right out to the edge, and the stand and fall flat to each other. Then fold the fall down and give it a preparatory iron. To engaunt the sleeve, start with the rectangle side and line it up, outside to outside, to the shorter side of the cuff to the mark stitch line. Baste it there. The heptagon with the rectangular side lined up to the line, making sure you have the correct one. If you have enough faith in yourself, you could do it without basting or just pin them. Chalk 1 cm down from the top of the rectangle before machining down the creases. Start at the top, back tacking, and back tack at the bottom, taking care that both stitches are as even as possible. Cut up the mark stitch line and stop a centimetre from the chalk mark to cut a mitre to both lines of stitching. Only through the sleeve, don't cut the gauntlet pieces. Fold the under gauntlet over the seam and maybe baste it to machine it along the edge over the exposed seam. Fold the top gauntlet now. Mine definitely needs to be re-ironed to get the creases in, and then I'm introducing the canvas. Then basting it to machine it along the edge at least beyond the mitre we cut. Fold the mitre down and out of the way. I'm folding the overlap at the tip of my over gauntlet inwards before basting it though, so that it won't be visible or in the way as I sew the point. I'm securing the pointy bit and then basting up the seam to the cuff of the sleeve. With the pieces secure, we can edge stitch around them, being sure that we also stitch across the base of the folded mitre. Me, however, I am felling them down, starting with the undergauntlet, so to most effectively hide the fastening, proceeding to stitch up and securing it again. Then starting at the top of the overgauntlet, felling down and then on the other sides of my point, proceeding to prick stitch across where we folded the mitre. And often there'll be another line of stitching half a centimetre behind that one as well, but I hadn't thought about it at that time. And that's my sleeves all prepared. Start with what will be the outer cuff and line it up to the canvas. It'll be fastest and easiest starting the baste from one side, with the two curved over your hand to baste them together, with the two curved over each other, the canvas being on the inside. Do the same again, smoothing from the first line of basting as well. If you're making double cuffs, make sure that you fold it in half so that it's in its natural state, and you may need double the total of bastes there though. Trim off any excess canvas once you're done. Before applying the other cuff, iron up one seam width on the sleeve side onto the wrong side. Apply the inside cuff now, right side to right side, basting in a similar manner with the cuff curved over your hand as we baste to the other side with the canvas on top. Again, when doing the second baste, smoothing across from the first. Start from the same side both times and trim off any excess fabric. Machine them together with a 1 cm seam allowance, starting and ending 1 cm from the sleeve side of the cuff, so from the folded up edge of the inside cuff. Trim them down at the beveled or curved corners to fold them out. Whether you want the seam to be exactly on the edge or slightly on the inside of the cuff is up to you, and we can't French seam around the perimeter just yet. With the inner yoke still folded down, lay the shirt fronts right side to right side, lining them up to the shoulders of the yoke. There is a small amount of ease to put in, so line them up and start basting from this shoulder towards the neck. When we get halfway through, we'll secure the baste and ease in the centimetre, like on jackets. Then we should do another staggered baste on top just to keep the ease secure. Use your iron to press the ease in if you can, and machine with a 1 cm seam allowance. Remove the basting before moving on. Iron our seam allowances into the yoke at this point. To put the inner yoke up, either baste and fill them to the yoke's seam allowance, or fold the shirt fronts and back into the outside of the back yoke. Then, not flush together, keep the inner yoke slightly below to be certain that it won't be tight. Baste and machine them to the seam allowance. Machine it right on the previous stitch or just next to it on the seam allowance's side. Cut down the seam allowance to about ½ centimetre, fold the shirt out again through the neck hole, iron the seam into the yoke again. Either way though, make sure the inner yoke has some ease. To hand sew it though, iron a small centimetre seam allowance on the inner yoke and line it up slightly below the machining so that it can be felled to the seam allowance and won't show on the outside. Baste it down in the same way as earlier because it has the same ease. This time though, I didn't start a new baste, just basted backwards to secure the ease before ironing the ease in. Then I'm filling it to the seam allowance, checking that my stitches don't show from the outside. Without back tacking, do the ½ centimetre seam top stitch over the yoke. Do this whichever method you used for the yoke. It'll take the strain if you felled it and provide a consistent aesthetic either way. First, check the neckline. Start from the middle and without any ease, check that it's the correct length both sides. If it isn't, lay the neckline flat and align the collar stood up along the centre back and to the plackets. Then we need to trace it. we need the new neckline to be equidistant all around the old neckline, then chalk on and cut out our new neckline. Mine was correct first time, it wasn't last time, and I don't know what I did differently. Starting at the center points, as always, line the collar up to the shirt, right side to right side. Maybe starting with 3 pins at the center point and the edges of the collar to make sure that the stand is lined up exactly to the placket edge. Distributing any ease there does happen to be while basting. A second baste here would be advisable. Essentially, machining this one only requires that we machine next to the folded up inside stand seam, so that we can fold all the seam allowances up into the collar to hide them. Though, that still should just be 1 centimeter. Check from the outside that the seams look good. With the second base staggered to the first, you'll be less likely to make any kinks or pleats in the seam. Even though there isn't any ease, I still think I managed to get some kinks. To fix it, take out the tiny bit of stitching, wet and steam the fabric, shrinking it in, and without backtacking, restitch what you took out, slightly overlapping what you didn't take out. Push and iron the seam allowances up into the collar. And this bit can be a bit of a chore. I'm also snipping away a small amount of the more bulky bits at either side to fit them in a little bit better. Baste the inner stand's pre-folded seam allowance to just a little above the stitch line. You could fill it down in the same way that I go into more detail in for the cuffs and similarly to how I did the inner yoke. Or skip this step, just leaving in the basting for now. Line up the back seams of the shirt body and the sleeve right sides to right sides. Make sure you have the correct sleeve though. The side with the gauntlet should be on the back side of the shirt. Firstly, check that it's about the correct size by just walking the seams together from one side to the other. If you have inlay, then you'd be lining up the mark stitches and walking them together from there. And honestly, I'm quite proud and surprised myself that it's correct to the few millimeters. Considering when I learned to make the sleeve pattern, the video didn't exactly have any audio, and it was in quarter scale, so I kind of had to guess and mathematic my way through it. There should be very little that needs to be eased in around the shoulders, but given how they'll need to be curved to fit together, baste in any ease we happen to have. Like the jacket, definitely do a second baste on top of the first one here. It's easiest to machine if you baste nearer to where we need to machine, so a centimeter or so from the edge. Press in any ease that there may have been. Machine along with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and back tacking both sides. Press the machining, remove the basting, check the line of stitching for kinks and pleats, again doing the same thing as we did for the collar if needs be. Ideally with a tailor's ham or just bit by bit over the thin end of the ironing board, iron the seam up away from the sleeve, creating a raised seam, checking it from the outside that the seam is properly opened. We need to cut the middle seam allowance to less than half the current seam allowance, so a bit less than 0.7 centimeters, in order to properly close this seam. We're cutting the seam allowance from the shirt and leaving the one from the sleeve. With the remaining seam, we need to fold it over the seam we cut so that the raw edge is back down at the machining, and the other raw edge is covered by it. As we do that, we should baste down to the armhole on the shirt along the center so that we can machine along the edge to seal it. You could baste it as you fold it and iron it later, or iron it as you go using the weight of the iron to hold in place what you folded and then baste it. Check one last time that the seam is properly open from the outside, because it's possible that it was moved as you were basting it. Machine it from the inside so that you can clearly see and follow the edge that we need to stitch along without backtacking. Press the seam again over your board or ham. With both sleeves on, this is where you could do a rudimentary fitting, lining up the mark stitches on the side seam and along the sleeve right side to right side, if you gave those seams some inlay, basting from those with their 1.5 cm seam allowance to determine if it fits around there properly. So sewing 1.5 cm from the mark stitches or from the raw edge. Flip it right side out and put it on whomever. For a real fitting we'd need a load more inlay, I think, and to baste on the cuff as well. We'd create the pleats and check that the sleeve hole is alright, but with the gauntlet something would have to have gone terribly wrong for it to be too small for someone's hand. I am back, and you can see that I moved the seam a little bit at the bottom. I rebasted it, and I'm cutting down my seam to 1.5 centimeters all the way across. We need to cut away any inlay we gave it so that we just have the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Machine from the hem and or the cuff all the way to the cuff and or the hem with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, of course. We need to press the seam so that it points towards the back of the shirt. In the sleeve with a sleeve board will be useful, but my trusty plank of wood will do. Like the armhole, we need to cut the back seam to a little less than half the front seam so that we can fold the now larger seam over the raw edges. Fold it over and iron or baste it down the middle as you go, but basting is specifically important along the sleeve, for which, once again, I'm using my plank of wood. Stitching with the inside up so that you can follow the edge again. One of the sides we need to start by bunching up the armhole and putting it under the needle, starting at the cuff and working towards the armhole. Then just the opposite for the other. I think we could actually start from the same side of both seams both times, but you might prefer one over the other, so I'll try both. Whichever way around, keep your fingers underneath and on top of the fabric. We don't want to catch anything other than our seam. And what with all the fabric that's so closely bunched up, it's very easy to do. And I had done it, which is what the cut is that you might see, that you might notice is. Remove the basting and inspect your handiwork, with the same basic things in mind as doing the sleeves. Once we're happy, we press the seam flat. There's no need to put a crease in just this second, however, what I do and what I think is best to do is use the open seam, the first seam of the two sleeve seams we machined, and fold the bottom of the sleeve along that in half to use as a guide to crease in the sleeve. In essence, we're just putting in pleats to match the dimensions of our cuff. How exactly you put in pleats can be personal preference. Usually we want to make 2 of them on the top gauntlet side facing the gauntlet, both the same size, the second starting where the first ended. But oddly, my cuff and sleeve are very similar in size, so I'm putting in one quite small pleat. So I'm measuring the two, halving the distance and putting in that from the top of the crease. For 2, you can check the subtitles for my vague maths. I kinda guessed the pleat, it seems, but I got it exactly right somehow. There shouldn't be any ease that needs to be put in around the sleeve, and it'd be almost completely unnecessary due to the pleats and being a shirt. So, put the sleeve and cuff together right side to right side, with the edges matched up properly, and machine them with the 1 cm seam allowance. Not sewing through the inside cuff, only the outside cuff with the canvas. Preferably over a sleeve board, press the seam allowance into the cuff, also pressing the pleats at this time. Fold the inner cuff's seam allowance up into the correct position, into the cuff, and baste it in place. Again, you could choose to fill it here or leave it basted and it'll be edge stitched later anyway. Cutting away the canvas at the bottom of the placket and intersect the last centimetre above the raw edge. Begin marking a 1 cm seam all along the hem to iron it towards the inside of the shirt. Or maybe you could just iron it up eyeballing it. It'll likely be tight in places, but we're going to fold 1/2 centimetre back down into the seam. You may prefer to go along by hand first, without the iron, basting the seam in place, rather than keeping your hand just ahead of a steamy iron. I would expect we all know what that's like. You could also first press the hem 1/2 centimetre upwards, ironing it up as you go, and then fold it another 1/2 centimetre, thereby trapping the raw edges in the same way. It may be an easier method. On both plackets, we might also like to fold or cut a triangle at the bottom of the hem so that it definitely won't be exposed. When it's folded and basted, iron it one more time from the front and back. Like the shoulder and side seams, we'll machine along the edge of the fold, while I'm starting with a vertical stitch on the placket. When I'm done, I'm going to use the loose threads and thread them into a needle in order to hide them in the folded up seam rather than just cutting them away, leaving them to possibly fray over time. It's just a more certain finish. Like the fall on the collar, we'll stitch around the perimeter of the cuff. For the cuff though, we'll start at the bottom on the under gauntlet side without back tacking, 1 centimeter from the sleeve. About 1.5 centimeters from the edge of the cuff towards the under gauntlet edge, and then up the cuff around with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. Making sure that when you get back to the sleeve edge of the cuff, we're the same distance from where we started. We'll create a complete loop, stitching overlapping the first few stitches. Though you could also finish right next to where you started, not overlapping at all, and we can take the excess thread, threading it into a needle and disappearing the thread into the cuff, cutting away the excess, like I did at either side of the hem. Now, if you didn't fell the cuff on the inside, then it's so simple as to machine right on the edge, back tacking at the start and the end to stitch the seam down. To edge stitch the collar, we're going to start about halfway into the stand and full side. Now, a little something we can do is to take some basting thread and stick a length through both sides of the stand. Machine right along the edge only a millimeter or two without backtacking again. Machine round the curve to the corner. At the corner, turn the shirt to machine back up into the stand along the lower edge, and you should be able to use the basting as leverage to pull the stand through, and then similar on the other side. although it was much less helpful than I expected to be, and trying to use it seemed to be more of a hindrance. Then, when you get back to the top of the centre back of the stand, overlap the stitching by a centimetre or two, or do the same as I described on the cuff. We'll first mark the top buttonhole. The first buttonhole is of course on the left side. With the pattern I used, I am measuring vertically down from where the fall starts, and then finding the halfway point between the top and bottom of the stand, at which point measuring 15mm centered on the point that we just found. Then for 7 total buttons, I suggest we measure between the hem and our first button. Take that measurement and divide it by 6, giving you the distance between each button and buttonhole. My top button to the hem is about 67.5 centimeters, so the distance between my buttons is about 9.5 centimeters. The top and bottom buttonholes are usually horizontal, while the rest are vertical. This keeps the center front on the center front. I'm measuring the center of our buttonholes 1.5 centimeters from the edge, because it's halfway over our placket and where the center front is. Then measuring 15mm vertically, centered on it again. For the bottom button though, I'm taking the center point and measuring 15mm either side of it horizontally. So it'll be about 7.5mm from the front edge at its closest point. Buttonhole sizes depending on the size of the button, but a normal size would be about 14mm and a 15 hole, I suppose. Before I go further, I'm going to copy them off to the other placket so that I know exactly where to put the buttons, making the center points clearer for myself just to continue the line onto the other placket. Plus basically what we did earlier on the stand, taking the center point, this time only needing to measure 7.5mm towards the front for the button placement. On the cuff, I drafted it very normally, and depending on the style, this dictates exactly what you do, but I'm finding the halfway point down the cuff, measuring 1 centimeter in, then another 15mm in for my buttonholes and or button locations. To sew the buttonholes, it won't be too deviant from normal buttonholes, except simpler. Starting with machining the perimeter of the hole, you could baste it in advance of that if you feel like it. On the gauntlet, there is almost always another button and buttonhole halfway down the opening. I didn't put one of those in my shirt because the button is usually smaller, and I didn't have one. If you can source them, then I suggest doing it, the hole being parallel to the gauntlet. I feel like we should use our normal hand thread doubled up. For a 15mm hole, you'd need about a 70cm length of doubled up thread. No gimp, cut a straight hole and stitch on one side, and I suggest pulling the knots into the hole. It takes me about 15 minutes to do a hole, and I suggest you start at the bottom hole, the top leaving to the last, which is why it looks good and my bottom one less so. Bar tack the second side when you get to the end and then stitch back to the start. Then bar tack the first side. We don't want it to be too thick, we don't want the buttonhole to be too bulky, so you might prefer to leave it as a bar, although I want to wrap the thread. There are plenty of videos about explaining how to sew buttons onto shirts. It's a very manly thing to know how to do. As tailors, I recommend we use Maurice Sidwell's own Dr. Ramroop's video. Hence, I'm not going to go too deep into this, just go watch and learn from him, though I think that we may only need 4 total stitches with his sextupleted thread, or quadrupled in my case. The way I like to do my buttons with a 4-hole button is to hold it diagonally and thread from the upper 3 holes all into the lower hole. I don't know, but I think it looks kind of like a clamshell or evokes the imagery thereof. I just kind of like the look of it. Looks quite novel. Of course, give it a shank and tying the thread around the base of said shank. At this point I can remove any and all bastes and mark stitches that I didn't remove already on top of the ones I left in the placket, because my buttons and buttonholes are holding my placket in place now. Firstly, I don't have an ironing board here, which makes it more difficult to iron my shirts, also meaning I basically can't iron my yoke. Though, if you had a tailor's ham, I'm sure that would, if I had a tailor's ham, that would help. However, I'm sure we've all seen every shirt ironing video on YouTube, so basically, thoroughly apply everything you've learned there, here. It's very simple. Just do a thorough iron. Not how you usually like to iron. Me, I skip the yoke and cuffs, but here, for its maiden christening, do it like you're a billionaire's butler or something. Channel your inner Alfred Pennyworth. Once again, for the sleeve crease, I very consistently use the first line of machining we did on the seam and pull that to the bottom edge of the crease to use as a guide to press the top crease in. On both sleeves, we're pressing the sleeve from both sides to iron it properly. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm kind of retarded. My two favourite Star Wars movies are Episode 1 and Rogue One. And I got mixed up when making the buttonholes. I made them horizontal all down the placket. I reshot it with the button side and mirrored the footage so it's easy to follow, but I had sewn all the buttonholes before I noticed, and it's really quite clear that I done fucked up. Just needed to get that off my chest and explain why it's wrong here. Yes, I'm recording the outro for 2 videos uploaded 4 weeks apart. What of it? I'd call this a qualified success. Now that I'm wearing it, I recommend the Dalston Mill Premium 100% cotton fabric a bit less than I already didn't. It's still fine for practice, but it is a bit itchy, I think. Certainly not horrific though. Next shirt I'm going to make will be with some denim fabric that I bought from a cheap fabric merchant, and that'll be in projects, which will be slightly more accessible content and not so specific to tailors. So, yay, possible growth. In the future, I'll make a video on making the different collars, plackets, and possibly black and white tie shirts if I can figure those out. Although, I'm not sure if that'll be a whole video on its own, or projects.